Hello everyone. Welcome to this Q&A session on the fabulous Ecologies of Amateur Theatre project. Hopefully most of you have watched the keynote video, and perhaps some of you have even read the book, which won the David Bradby Prize in 2019. So a couple of things. First of all, this session's being recorded, so please just bear that in mind if you do participate. At the moment, that recording will be available to other delegates only. It won't be made public. My name is Katie Beswick. I am I'm the communications officer on the executive committee of TAPRA, and I'm really pleased to have been asked to chair this keynote. I am a blonde woman who would rather her age remained ambiguous. I have red glasses and a navy and white striped Breton top, and I'm sitting in my house in South London with some paintings in the background and a mirror to my left, which maybe is my right in the camera video. So how today is going to work is thus. I will introduce each of our keynote speakers in turn, and I'll let them describe themselves once I've finished speaking, and then we'll get going with the keynote, and it'll be a little bit of a panel discussion at first between myself and the keynote speakers, and then we'll open up questions to the floor. So you can either raise a digital hand or use a digital icon to indicate that you'd like to ask a question, or you can just type your question into the chat box. If you type your question into the chat box, I will read it out, so I won't call on you. So if you do want to speak, then that's fine, but just make sure you raise your hand in that case. Okay, so let's get started. So our three keynote speakers are Nadine Holdsworth. So Nadine Holdsworth is Professor of Theatre and Performance Studies at the University of Warwick in the UK. She has research interests in theatre and national identities, popular theatre practitioners, and amateur creativity and cultural participation. She's published many books, including most recently English Theatre and Social Objection. And she's currently working on a new body of research on arts and homelessness. Would you just like to audio describe yourself, Nadine?
Yeah, of course. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming to this. I'm a white woman in my early 50s. I've got brown hair in a bob. I've got black glasses, and I'm sitting in my study, which has got navy blue walls and lots of art on the background.
Great, thank you. We also have Professor Jane Milling, who is currently head of drama at the University of Exeter. Jane works on questions of participation, popular amateur theatre, and cultural value in theatre and performance in the modern period and the long 18th century. Jane, would you like to?
Hi, yes, hello, great to be doing this. My name's Jane Milling. I'm a white middle-aged academic woman with short brown hair, and I'm sitting in front of my bookcase.
Thanks, Jane. And our third speaker is Helen Nicholson. Helen is Professor of Theatre and Performance at Royal Holloway, University of London. She's published widely on applied theatre, including the arts in dementia care, theatre education and performance with people who have experienced trauma, displacement and homelessness. Helen recently led research on the National Theatre's Public Acts programme, which was a nationwide initiative of participatory performance with community partners. She's currently working on several projects, including with Professor Jenny Hughes on a grant on the role of civic theatre in towns. Helen, if that's over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Katie, and thank you for everybody for coming. I am a white woman with fair hair and glasses sitting in front of my bookcase, and I am in my 60s.
Thanks, Helen. Fantastic. So I thought we'd just start the session by asking you each to speak a little bit about the project. Hopefully most people have at least engaged with the keynote, but it might be good to get a sense of what the project was and why you were each interested in amateur theatre and wanted to be involved in a project on that subject. So we'll start first with you, Helen.
Thanks, Katie. It was a kind of slightly quirky choice, I suppose, in a sense, in that I'd written quite a lot about community and I'd written about community building, and on my way home from work then I used to drive past a village hall in Old Windsor, where they put on about 3 productions a year. And I drove past this, and clearly sometimes I'd see people go in and out, and sometimes the productions were on. And, you know, there am I writing about community-based theatre. And I thought, why has nobody looked at amateur theatre, which is really at the heart of many communities? And just because it doesn't have a professional there, to kind of, I say this against myself really, but to try and change what they're doing, I kind of got intrigued by what they might be doing sort of beneath our radar, as it were.
Great, thanks, Helen. Jane, we'll move to you next.
Thanks. Yes. Well, it came as a sort of logical step. I've been working on a project called Understanding Everyday Participation, articulating cultural value with folks at Manchester, Warwick and Leicester, and colleagues here in Exeter. And we'd been looking at what it meant, what the values of participating in culture and different kinds of culture, and culture that might not count as culture, and how people were articulating what value they gained from that, and what value they saw it in terms of community building and community forming. And so then we were sort of in that team thinking about notions of expertise, and then talking to Helen after a kind of slightly tense session on Richard Sennett's Craftsman, to which he came sort of midway through a chat I was giving about how I had some questions about it. It sort of emerged that actually we were very interested, and then working with Nadine as well, we became very interested in this notion of expertise of the amateur, of that question of people who really do develop lifelong kind of engagement with a specific kind of practice. And these are not folks who are just sort of dabbling necessarily, although some do. So I'm thinking, well, why is this whole area of work not being looked at in more detail? So that's sort of where my interest and first sort of start into the project came from.
Fantastic, thank you. Nadine?
Yeah, similarly to Helen, really, I was interested in how this developed work I'd previously done around community theatre, in particular kind of communities of practice and what theatre can do within communities. But it also had a really personal kind of trajectory as well. I live in a market town, I don't live in a city, and the only theatre that is here is one of the beautiful theatres that's part of the Little Theatre Guild. And I was aware of it in the town. I'd been to see things, and actually had a friend who was RADA trained as an actor, but got out of the profession due to kind of economic precarity, and he was often performing at this amateur theatre, so I'd go and see him. And then I was aware of friends' kids who were going and performing. That was their route into theatre, performing at this beautiful little kind of 90-seater theatre, but then going on to do theatre degrees and going then into the profession. So kind of aware that it was a much more complex picture than the stereotypes that we normally get about what amateur theatre is. So that was my kind of route in.
Great, thank you. As someone who was asked to sort of respond to the keynote, it's really interesting to hear your reflections on the project, because one of the things that really struck me was the way that, I guess I'm somebody who just absorbed all of the sort of amdram stereotypes, the idea of these things maybe being a bit naff or old-fashioned, and to read about, I think, the sort of porous nature of the relationship between amateur and professional was one of the most interesting things to me about the book. And also, I think I've found engaging with the work through the keynote in the context of the conference fascinating. So in relation to some of the themes that have arisen in other panels I've been to, so questions of weathering, of friendship, of being together and so on. And all of this in a political environment where it seems like, you know, I've been feeling a lot recently like the era of the individual isn't really sustainable. So I guess this kind of like neoliberal process that we're in crisis about, we need to find new models and kind of modes of working. And one of the things that struck me about the project was the way that some of the practices and processes of amateur theatre, they offer maybe a mode of shifting some of those more hierarchical neoliberal modes of participation, which dominate theatre cultures, but which also, I think, dominate research cultures. So I guess my response to your keynote is that what I'm really interested in is issues of collaboration, of alternative economies, of kind of enduring communities that persist over time. And one of the very interesting things is the idea of these enduring hyperlocal communities, but which are also nationally and internationally networked. And some of that speaks, I think, to ideas of unionization, which have become kind of impossible in industry in many ways to sustain. So my first question, I suppose, or series of questions is, how might these ways of working through amateur theatre provide models for our own work as researchers and for modes of social and political organising beyond the theatre? And then I was also struck by how your project functioned as a collaboration in which you all appeared to have a sort of similar role. So there doesn't appear to have been, and I may be wrong about this, but a PI who was leading everything, and with co-Is who were in some senses junior to them. So I was also interested in you each speaking a little bit about the way that the collaboration functioned on the project, and if and how the collaboration you were seeing in the amateur theatre influenced how you worked together on the project. So I guess I'll go to Nadine first with that, if you're okay, and then Nadine, when you're finished, if you just want to indicate somebody else to take on.
Yeah, sure. I think one of the things that just really chimed with me, what you just said, Katie, is that idea of how we might learn from kind of the ways that they work within amateur theatres in our own practice, or in our own working, days and modes. So one of the things that really struck me with the companies that I was looking at was just how very horizontal the models were in terms of power. On the whole, not always, but on the whole, very, very horizontal, and a sense of you needed to be just as happy to kind of sign up to come and do a session in the bar, to run the bar, or to be on the box office, as to be directing the next show. And that seems to me something, in terms of that question you're saying about collectivity and kind of working and unionization, there was a real recognition, I think, of the value that was brought by all the different kind of people and all the different roles that needed to be done to make this amateur theatre work happen, and get to a stage and get to an audience. So that's an immediate response from me. I think there's something really interesting about that, horizontal models of power and collective kind of ownership and engagement and willingness to clean the toilets as much as to be the person taking a leading role. And I'll hand over to Helen.
Thanks, Nadine. I was thinking about this question yesterday evening, and actually I was reminded of the wonderful late great David Bradby, whom we miss, and who is very much with us today. And I remember after an event, he and I kind of, Royal Holloway, he and I were putting the chairs away together. And he said to me in that, those of you remember David, rather clipped way he had, you know what, Helen, there are some people who run a mile when there's a chair to be put away, and some people who just get on with it. And I think what we found within amateur theatre was a lot of people who were in the just get on with it camp, who really kind of had, particularly those who got buildings, but others as well, who got a real connection to their theatre and to their company. And so they do anything really to kind of keep that going. And if it involves, knocking down walls or painting walls, or, kind of cleaning up after a show or whatever it was, then they would really all pitch in and do that. And one of the other things that I think goes alongside that is the kind of longevity of commitment that people have. And that can be both a good thing and a bad thing. But one of the positive things about it is that people really get to know each other over a lifetime. So they support each other through friendship and through kind of deep connections, really, through thick and thin. And I think, many of us in the academy, really value the length of connection. And I think that's, one of the reasons why we have to be really careful within the academy about precarity and so on, because those sorts of connections over time, that build up over time, we really saw how valuable it was to people's sense of well-being and sense of identity and sense of community, because they always felt welcomed. And if they weren't feeling very well, for example, or if they're going through a rough time, they might have a slightly different role in the company for a bit. Nobody would really kind of make a fuss about it. They just quietly be doing something else, and somebody would say to you kind of quietly on the side, so and so's going through a bit of a rough time this time, so they'd sort of help him with the costumes or whatnot. So I think that kind of level of care and those kind of infrastructures were really, really helpful, I think, to so many people we encountered. And there's a lot we can learn from that.
Yes, and just to pick up on that and what Helen and Nadine have been saying, that was also sort of played out through the kind of what we might call the diverse economies that you know, that absolutely is at the basis of all of what was going on. That, you know, when you think about, you know, gift and volunteer and barter and loan and so forth, you know, they are all, you know, affective modes of engaging with each other and building community through economic exchange as well. We can think of it as an economics, and that was really evident. So, you know, these are not people who are wanting to move this work into a different mode, a different scale always, although some of them are, and some of them do use it as a kind of a sort of jump zone into other modes, say professional directing or writing and so forth, and who use it as a kind of stepping stone or keeping themselves sharpened, honed. But it is this sense that there was really which made it such a warm activity of collaboration, not only between us as researchers and the whole research team, but also the generosity of those that we were dealing with. I mean, it's not our role to be advocates for, but actually the pleasure of being engaged with, you know, those who we were researching alongside in the amateur movement was just delightful, actually. And it came out of, I think, what is this very much the spirit of the diverse economies that surround amateur theatre, and therefore the kind of that generation of values for people that emerges from that.
Thank you. As you're talking there about issues of economy, issues of feeling welcome, I guess that the unspoken question again is kind of who, and has come up again for me through this conference with things like audio description, and the way in which obviously including one type of person sometimes also means that problems are created with who perhaps doesn't then feel welcome or isn't included. And I suppose one of the perceptions that one has of amateur theatre, which the keynote indicated was not wrong, is that it's a very white very white communities of practice. But actually your keynote said that the issues of class were much more complicated than we might think of it as a white middle class form, but this wasn't how it necessarily operates. So I don't know if Jane, if I can go back to you there, and you might want to speak a little bit to that, and then again pass on if anybody you think might be able to answer that question a bit more fully.
Just as I mean, we didn't do a sort of demographic study as such. We weren't looking sort of statistically at this, but just to reflect on, we did engage with a really, really wide range of companies. And we are specifically talking about the amateur theatre movement as such, as it were. So we are predominantly talking about those who affiliate themselves to membership societies and who kind of name themselves as within the amateur theatre sort of organizational structures, as it were. So there is a lot, of course, of amateur performance and amateur engagement that doesn't situate itself within amateur drama and amateur theatre, and that is much more diverse. And anyway, that's a whole different conversation to be had. So, you know, there are sort of boundaries around what we were looking at. But there's the thing that we found was that actually, yes, it's not about white middle class privilege and activity, that actually there were very diverse ranges of individuals, you know, ex-stockbrokers and folks just out of the military working alongside each other, folks who were doing it because they were unemployed and were kind of going slightly crazy, stir crazy at home, folks who were coming to it for a whole range of different reasons. It's also very intergenerational. One of the things that we also noticed was that it had really quite a high level of folks with a variety of sort of disabilities, kind of very intensely and performatively engaged with it. So there are ways in which other kinds of perhaps what we might consider sort of disadvantage or kind of unexpected sort of openings and welcomes available within it. Perhaps pass over to Nadine.
Yes, I'll pick up on the issue you raise about kind of racial representation. I think, I mean, one of the long-standing problems, I think, with amateur theatre, which is being recognised, is the lack of representation of global majority members. And some of the things that we looked at in the book were around, you know, kind of the issues with that and the barriers, or the kind of exclusionary practices that happen that lead to kind of barriers for inclusion, but also some of the activity that was going on to try and change that, to be self-aware, to be self-regulating, to look at different modes of kind of practice and engaging more diverse communities. I think we'd all agree, and those within the amateur sector would agree, there's still a huge way to go. But actually it's been interesting, even I think beyond us finishing this book, there's been another step change in the amateur theatre movement trying to address these issues. And actually I'm looking at my screen and I can see Anne-Marie Green, who's kind of there. And I know Anne-Marie has done a huge amount of work at the Criterion Theatre in Coventry, trying to develop policies and practice, which are then being disseminated through movements like the Little Theatre Guild, through the Drama Festivals Association. So I think there's a huge amount of work to do, but there's definitely a sea change in attitudes and a recognition that there is important work to be done. And it'll be really interesting to maybe hear from Anne-Marie in the conversation about work that's happening on the ground. Sorry, Anne-Marie, it's because I can see you.
I think, should I just come in on that? I mean, it's an issue, I think, in terms of the Black and global majority performers. What I think is also needs to be said is that the vast majority of amateur theatre takes place in towns where they're probably, I'm working in Hastings at the moment, and it's a 95% white town. Now there are questions to be asked about why it's a 95% white town, but you can't go to the theatre, who are actually trying very hard at the moment to kind of do quite a lot of stuff around homophobia and racism, but you can't go and say, well, where are all your Black performers, because they take from a very local area. So I think there's it reflects a wider problem in society, as well as actually what's going on within the amateur theatre movement. And I think where I found most Black and global majority performers and members were in the more affluent areas. So the most diverse, if I may use that term, was the CDOS, which is the stockbroker, can't remember its full title, but it's city workers basically. It was founded by the stockbrokers. So they're very wealthy and also very global, and that's quite an internationally inclusive, but also a lot of it's far more kind of integrated than most other companies. And the Questors, to a certain extent in Ealing, indicated to me the importance of word of mouth. They wanted to do a production of Rafter, and one of the members said, well, I get my mates in, I've got a lot of friends that would like to be in that. And then of course they bring in their mates from the Asian communities that are close by Ealing or in Ealing, and then they stay. So there's a kind of journey that's happening. But I also noticed, and again, near where David Bradby lived, actually in Sheringham, they've just had a really big festival on rural racism, trying to counter rural racism that young people have led in their little theatre as an amateur. So there's moves afoot, but it's, we also encountered some attitudes we really didn't like. I think it's fair to say.
Thanks, Helen, Jane and Nadine. So after this next question, I'm going to hand over to the audience. So if you have got questions brewing you want to write down or you want to prepare to ask, then just to give you a fair warning of that. So the questions I've asked and the themes I've introduced so far have been quite macro in the sense that they speak to wider social and political issues, but this is a theatre and performance research conference, and I guess I am also interested in issues of theatre making and the actual practices and processes of that exist in the amateur community. So I wondered if I'll come to you first, Nadine, but if you could speak a little bit about making and what actually went on and what is distinctive about the amateur community in the sense of theatre making and the aesthetic processes, but also the practical nuts and bolts of making theatre.
Lovely, thanks, Katie. Yes, I'm reminded something that really struck me when I was looking at making was a comment that was made by Wainwright, and Ian was one of the producers on the Open Stages programme that the RSC ran. And in a conversation, I think Helen was there as well, he said, at the RSC, we're used to making theatre all the time, we've got incredibly gifted people around here, but we do not know how to make amateur theatre. And that it really struck me in terms of thinking, okay, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to make amateur theatre? And I think that it is about the practicalities very often. So you're thinking about the material constraints that people are working under, that means that they're having to be really inventive about how they reuse props, reuse costume, thinking really creatively on their feet about working in, within those material constraints. There's a certain temporal structure which is very different. So if you think about how a professional kind of production would unfold over, say, I don't know, 4 weeks of rehearsal, but every day, you're looking at rehearsals happening 3 or 4, 3 times a week, after people have very often done a working day. And they're often bringing the kind of stresses and strains of that working day into the rehearsal room. So there's those very kind of nuts and boltsy kind of practicalities of making amateur theatre. But then the actual kind of processes that we encountered were really, that I encountered, I will say, were really akin to professional models in terms of, the care that was taken over trying to engage in character development, the directorial processes. I remember seeing a show through and going to several rehearsals, and the props person was there every single rehearsal and just sitting and taking notes. And I talked to her about kind of, that's really interesting that you're just here and present all the time. And she was talking about, yes, but it's really important because I'm seeing it from an audience's perspective, and I'm trying to pick up on things that might go wrong or that we need to think about. So there was an incredible care that was taken around the development of productions that I certainly encountered. I could go on and on, but I will hand over to Helen to maybe to pick up on some other things.
Thanks, Nadine. I've just realised that one of the things that we haven't said is that that we were part of a bigger team, and I think we'd all really like to acknowledge the partners in the team. So the RSC was partner for one of the projects, the Little Theatre Guild, and particularly the other researchers on the project, which were postdocs Erin Walken at Exeter and Molly Flynn, who worked with us on the RSC strand of the project, and also Cara Gray and Sarah Penny, who were in the last, I think, funded PhD students. I just wanted to kind of make sure we fully acknowledge them because they really did a lot of work in looking at the processes of making. So Cara, for example, did her PhD on the backstage work of amateur theatre. So she not only did a PhD, but she also learned how to use a drill. Arguably slightly, anyway, I won't say which I think is more useful, but she found a huge care in recycling and remending, and she did a lot of work also in people's homes. She kept being invited to people's houses where they were kind of making costumes on their kitchen tables and designing sets in their garages and so on and so forth. So this kind of expansion wasn't a compromise, it was part of people's identities. One costume maker, for example, that she encountered was working at home, but also had her sewing machine next to her to remind her that she wasn't just working in a particular way, she also had other things going on in her life. So I think expertise, kind of the amateurs often associated with kind of being a bit shoddy, but we found considerable expertise and often a kind of professional expertise. So for example, I met somebody who was doing some really interesting sound work, and he said, yeah, I work as an engineer in my day job, but I don't get a chance to experiment, and I'm really getting a chance to experiment with the theatre company and with this rig. Same with lighting. We found electricians that use their experiences of electrician, but wanted the creativity of working with a rig. So that kind of relationship between amateur and professional is not just professional theatre and amateur theatre. It's people's day jobs, as it were, and how they bring their expertise, but find a sort of creative route for it. That said, I absolutely concur with Nadine's point. I saw some work that's very similar to professional work, but I also saw some that wasn't, that was quite quirky. And there was one production in particular that I went to follow, and I sat looking at the directors who sort of really didn't look up much. They were kind of following their scripts. Anyway, the production was okay, and off I went, and I was invited to the kind of post-show event, and they'd very kindly agreed to sort of answer my questions. And I said, they said, what did I think? And I said, oh, I thought it was great, you know, really like this, that, and the other. But perhaps it wasn't quite necessary to pull the curtains across in every transition, because those curtains take quite a long time to get across the stage. And sometimes, oh, no, you're quite wrong. You're quite wrong. So I thought, right, okay, that's probably where I leave that, you know, because I didn't want to kind of, you know, make them feel bad about it. So there were practices that we, you know, really did feel a bit village hall. But that said, the audience, and I wish we'd done more research on the audience, we didn't have time, but the audience really kind of came together for celebrating the kind of local creativity, which, you know, even in a little village hall where they were doing their best, I think made a difference. I don't know, Jane, what your experience of the making process was.
Absolutely. Well, both that and just to sort of emphasize that kind of that range of what we saw at the People's in Newcastle. You know, I saw a show in a huge auditorium that was, you know, as good, as successful, as aesthetically beautiful and, you know, achieved as things that I've seen in my civic theatre. And then at the other end, I sit in my, you know, the village hall out on the moor, and it's everybody is either on the stage or in the audience, and, you know, the audience are prompting to help out, you know, when things get a little bit lost after the interval. But that doesn't matter at all, because everybody is wearing fairy lights, and, you know, it's a real celebration of kind of what's happening. And it's not aspiring to be your professional scale. It's not trying to do that job. It's asking of itself a different kind of making and a different kind of relationship to its audience. And so that range is sort of within what we were looking at. But perhaps just one final thing to just add about what I thought I was sort of looking at that was quite interesting, was about the relationship to repertoire and the choice of plays. Now, I guess one thing to say is that it's not necessarily a hugely diverse repertoire that folks are doing necessarily, but it's absolutely vital to the survival of, you know, what gets staged. And the thing that was really surprising about it was the number of kind of the amount of new writing that was in that, the amount of kind of the second productions of a West End show, or of a new piece that had just been on at the National, and the sort of very close relationship that we found between, say, you know, book publishers Nick Hearn and Sam French and so forth, you know, who were very closely engaged with the amateur, because they know that the amateur sector is a place where plays will have an ongoing life, where repertoire, particularly repertoire that has, you know, strong choral or big casts, or those, you know, expensive to do kind of shows, do get staged again and again and are kind of celebrated and enjoyed really widely. And it's part of a kind of really important dissemination of that kind of writing, sort of, you know, more broadly outside the West End or outside kind of, you know, major metropolitan theatres. So that's just to sort of chip in that kind of another sort of level or kind of making that we were watching.
Yeah, I thought that was so interesting in the keynote about the way that the amateur sector works to build a contemporary canon. I thought that was really fascinating. Again, these boundaries between the professional and the amateur that are more porous. But it would be interesting to hear from some of the audiences now. We have a question from Kerry Schaefer in the chat, but before we go to that, does anybody have a question they want to speak, just because it'll give me a chance to scan Kerry's question so I'm not reading it cold. Claire Cochrane, we'll come to you first.
Thanks ever such a lot. I thought your video was wonderful. I really enjoyed it. What struck me was something that Helen said when she was talking about the arty party, and that anecdote about with one of your interviewees who'd been to a supposed consultation and just came away feeling kind of stigmatized and patronized by the experience. And I was starting to think about to what extent we within our departments are also the arty party, and about the relationship between what you have identified with the fact that undoubtedly some of our undergraduates come out of this experience, either by youth theatre or other adult theatre companies, and then if they don't get work or achieve their dreams afterwards, go back into these amateur companies. And I kind of think about the way, in a sense, with our own discipline, we're kind of moving in another direction, particularly the performance studies direction, where a sense that the divergence between what's happening in terms of repertoires and interests and practices within these companies, and what we then teach within our own departments, and thinking about the threat to our own departments at the moment. And whether in terms of the amateur term, there's whether any of this can be used to form alliances, synergies with what happens within our own departments. So it isn't quite so much that sense of the researchers going out to look at those others. And I know that isn't how you experienced it. That's not how you described it. But I'm not sure that's a coherent question, but I'd be interested to hear your response.
Should I have first crack at that, as I wrote about the arty party, and then other people can come in? I mean, just to kind of say thank you, Claire, that's a fantastic question. And also to say thank you for all the work that you did that we really built on in the project. We really appreciated that. And I know you came to some of the events as well. So thanks for that. I would agree. I think that in terms of the arty party, the idea behind that was that, in a sense, the idea that the arts were around self-improvement and so on was something that is part of the history of this movement. And I came across it in Letchworth Garden City, where it had been part of the sort of radical movement of the town in the early days. And there was a kind of sort of sense of being slightly patronizing to people because they didn't necessarily want to turn up to multiple productions of Tolstoy or whatever else the elite of the town wanted to put on. I'd hope we aren't there, but I think there's more of a porous boundary between the kind of work we do in universities and the amateur sector than we perhaps acknowledged. And I think particularly the youth theatre sector, which we didn't look at in particular, I'm now looking at a bit more, is going to be really important. There are an awful lot of amateur theatres, particularly the Little Theatre Guild, who have really got very strong youth theatres. And that's going to be increasingly, I think, a place where young people have their experience of theatre making. And get the bug, I think that's going to be really important in that area. And at the moment I'm working with the Little Theatre Guild. They're thinking about putting on kind of one act, kind of writing, trying to get some new commissions for writing plays to go for youth theatre. So I think that's going to be really important. But there's also the circularity at the other end. And there's one woman in her 30s who did a drama degree who runs one of the little theatres, and she said, look, my friends are scraping around trying to find bits of Arts Council money and trying desperately to, find enough money to stage performances that they want to stage. She works in IT in her day job, but she said, I've just spent £15,000 on lighting and sound equipment in the theatre that I run. And she really cares about that and has that kind of opportunity to kind of experiment. She said, I like plays, I like play scripts, I like performing plays. She said, I enjoyed the stuff about Franco being my degree, but I really like plays. And so I think there is more of a circularity than perhaps we imagine. And I think perhaps as a discipline, it would be great to engage more and ask the kind of questions, give the kind of cultural recognition of the work, but ask the kind of questions and give the kind of support that might help it move forward. I don't know what Jane and Nadine think. That's fair.
Yeah, just to concur and to say, sorry, Nadine, sorry to speak over you, but I mean, that's also been my journey in, right? That's, you know, my first experience of theatre was, yeah, and participation was being in an amateur company and loving every second of it. So I absolutely concur. That's inevitably how some of our students, a lot of our students, are coming to us.
I was just going to add, we also talked a lot about what the professional theatre could learn from the amateur as well, you know, particularly around audience development, you know, developing those big communities that just come out and support work, you know, regardless of what the repertoire is. Very often they're just, you know, a lot of certainly little theatre guilds, they have membership schemes where people sign up for the, right, you're going to go and see all 10 of these and they will pay for those 10 shows, but, you know, but at the start of the season, and go and see them regardless of whether it's an Acheborn or, you know, whatever. So that we did talk about that. So I think that's quite an interesting thing in terms of the ecology of the discipline and the sector.
Great, thanks guys. I'm going to read a question now from the chat and then we'll go to someone, then I'll read and we'll go to someone. That might be all we have time for though, because we've only got 15 minutes. So just to say, there are a lot of questions in the chat that might remain unanswered, and that's not deliberate. I'm not choosing them. I'm just going to do first come, first served. So Kerry Schaefer says that she's thinking about the distinction between community-based or community-engaged theatre and amateur theatre, and mainly about whether you feel your work had any impact on the discourse of excellence or innovation that still seems to rule in arts funding contexts. So I don't know if anyone wants to take that question.
Jane?
I think this is a sort of, it's a historic legacy, isn't it? So this is, you know, quite a lot of folks have been writing about this, about the way in which, you know, the Arts Council kind of attempted to try to kind of corral who it could allow itself to fund with it, for, you know, from its tiny pot, by trying to set some of these barriers and standards. And actually we're seeing, I think, just infinitesimally seeing shifts now. I think really just noticing over the past sort of 5-6 years, you know, the way in which you know, cultural policy and Arts Council funding is beginning to sort of to shift. There is a kind of a sense of, actually perhaps these aren't necessarily the right terms and criteria for everything that we might want to encourage people to be involved in.
Great. If no one else wants to come in, we'll go to David Wiles, who I think was the next person with his hand up.
Yeah, great. This is such an interesting topic, and I'm so glad you've gone into it. I think my question, it follows on from Claire's, and I think it also connects with Kerry's excellence question and Alex's sort of fringe versus amateur question. You started by, a jumping off point was Sennett's work on craftsmanship. And from kind of my dabbling in a bit of amateur theatre at one point, I mean, what leaps out at me is that there's a very strong ethic of craft. There's an ideal of excellence, that you imitate how the professionals did it. You even replicate the West End production. And there's a very anxiety around the notion of originality. Whereas working with students, there's a very bumpy relationship to any notion of craft, but a very high premium on the idea of originality. Does that seem, how does that relate to how you frame what you're observing and coming up with?
I'll jump in on craft, I think. One of the things that was really surprising, not surprising, but was marked in what we found, was just how people took their craft very seriously. And not just kind of in a sense of, you know, oh, well, I know what I'm doing and off I go, but wanting to learn and wanting to get better at that craft, and that there are many mechanisms within the kind of amateur theatre to improve that. You know, I write in the book about the NODA. They do, you know, a week-long series of workshops, professionally led workshops that people kind of take a week off work to go and do and pay for. Which is really extraordinary, and a real kind of sense of wanting to not be professional, or, you know, but to improve, to be the best that they can be. So certainly I recognize that, David, in what you're saying in terms of that commitment to craft and improvement as opposed to originality.
Yeah, and just to sort of pick up on that, I think I probably agree with you, David. I think that's partly comes, although there were quite a lot of, say, youth groups or side shoots from companies that do and attempt to do more original, more challenging, more that have set for themselves a kind of, look, let's do something different. Let's be the fringe bit of what the mainstream company is doing. So there is some of that spirit inside, but I think part of the structure of what amateur theatre companies is about a sort of inclusivity for those who are involved in it, and therefore they aren't necessarily pushing towards that, primarily towards let's make something radical and original. They're actually moving more, because of the structures within which they're working, towards who can we bring along with us most effectively. So I wonder if that has a kind of some kind of structural function within what the range of what they imagine themselves doing.
I think there's also something about apprenticeships that we noticed intergenerationally, in that people pass down their craft, but I've also noticed things the other way around now. There was some young people fiddling around on their phones and changing the lighting states in a theatre I was in recently, and you know, the old boys that have been, you know, kind of operating the lighting for some time now, let's say, were kind of a bit sniffy to start off with, and then start to go, oh, that's interesting, how'd you do that then? So I think, you know, originality isn't necessarily a kind of endpoint. And I noticed a little bit in the chat somebody asking about scripts, and they mostly do play scripts, but nonetheless there's a kind of eagerness to kind of be the best of what they can do, and to kind of change with the times as well.
Great, thank you. So I'm just going to read the next question from the chat, which is from Rachel Han. And Rachel says, question on race and amateur UK theatre. You note progressive projects such as Sheringham, etc., yet also imply that examples of racist practice did feature within the groups you studied. Did you, or do you plan to cite these in your outputs? And if not, why not? So I'll leave that to you to decide who to come to.
Yeah, I'll come in on this. Yeah, thanks, Rachel. We did. So there's a section in the book where we talk about the fact that, you know, unbelievably, blacking up was still practice that could be found in amateur theatre up to, I think the last example I would talk about was 2016. So we do name it and call it out as the racist practice that it is, as well as recognising, hopefully, you know, some of the more progressive things. And I think that's what it was, you know, difficult territory to tread, but it felt really important to us kind of politically to be invested in those questions and to have them marked within the output.
Great. Did anyone else want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think there were some things that were difficult to write about as well, in terms of being there on trust, and perhaps conversations that we had quietly. Nobody should ever, amateur or professional in my view, ever do a production of Aladdin ever again. There were all kinds of, you know, problematic stereotypes. I mean, pantomime is sort of built on stereotypes, so quite often it's people who found it a bit difficult to kind of negotiate some of those boundaries. So that was quite hard. So some of those conversations were had privately as well. And actually people have gradually started to shift a little bit as a result of those conversations. And I think not everything from that point of view. We didn't document every conversation, but we tried to capture, if you like, some of the challenges and difficulties of that within the book, in the way in which you know, felt that we were doing good. There were things that weren't documented in the book that were very specific. And one particularly in pantomime that felt uncomfortable. Why not? I think we tried to tackle the issue more as a set of ways of thinking and ways of being that Nadine tackled very in particular, led with that and practices rather than naming and shaming individuals. I noticed on the Aladdin front, I noticed that there was an advert for a professional company with Rufus Hound in some very doubtful makeup only last week. And you know, it's racist, it's appalling, but it's still happening, and the amateur sector will look at that and not feel that it's challenged. So let's ban Aladdin.
Great. I presume we've finished with that question, so we'll go on now to Jane Gold. I think was the next person with the hand up.
Thank you. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you so much to the three of you for doing, and the others who worked on it, for doing this project, for talking about it today, because I personally found it really inspiring, and it's really brought out things that have been forgotten for so long. So thank you very much. My question was around this idea of, well, two things really, that the amateur as the expert, and also professionals working within the amateur sector. And the fact that often, particularly I found that on a local level, it's actually the amateur groups that bring in the most money. If there is a theatre, like here in Brecon, it will sell out when the local group are putting on their pantomime several times over. But when they've got a more prestigious company in, there'll be like 20 people in the audience and they won't make any money. And this sort of goes back as well. I found sort of in the early 19th century, when a local amateur was performing on the stage with the stalling players, then, you know, the amateur is in bold letters and it's really important. So I wondered, like, whether you felt like when you were looking at particularly the more sort of small rural areas, whether this distinction between amateur and professional is actually really needed at all, and whether that's something that may not be important when you're not looking at larger cities.
I think that's sorry if I can sort of jump in. I think that's really interesting that we might not need the distinction between amateur and professional anymore, because I do think there's something really important about paying people to make art. So I don't want to sort of argue that we sort of get to a point where we say, actually, let's all just do it for the love. But I mean, your point, Jane, absolutely, that in fact, you know, when you look hard, if you look at any civic theatre in the UK, it will be supported financially by amateur companies and what they bring to it financially in those weeks. And that might be through student companies, it might be through youth theatres, it might be through, you know, mainstream amateur production, as it were, all kind of, you know, adult amateur companies. But also they are really important in terms of a small scale associational spaces. So very often what I found when I was looking at villages, at the kind of, you know, the village hall and so forth, its refurbishment costs are most often met by amateur theatre company productions. That's where they make enough to put the new porch on and so forth. And there is a porous relationship with it, because as we found, as I'm sure perhaps Nadine and Helen could talk about this a bit more as well, you know, many of the companies actually have made successful Arts for All grants and lottery funded grants, and have been improving and enhancing. Those companies that run buildings have been improving and enhancing that provision through this kind of porous relationship with what we might think as professionally sponsoring subsidy that comes. Perhaps Nadine and Helen, you've got more to add on that with specific examples.
Yeah, I can give a specific example from the theatre that's in my hometown, which has had a series of iterations and building projects so that it's grown and grown and grown. So it started off as a room, and then it applies for money, it gets some rehearsal space, and then they apply for a bit more money, and then they extend the bar. So absolutely, that sense of kind of drawing on those funds that Jane's talking about, and that continual sense of kind of evolution, I think, is really interesting along that as well, that not kind of standing still. I think very often amateur theatre gets kind of tarred with the idea of it being kind of just, you know, it stays in its own kind of zone and does its own thing, but actually wanting to grow, build, extend, not just in terms of buildings, but repertoires and what's going on kind of inside those buildings as well.
Great. Okay. So we're almost at the end of this session. It's been really fascinating and touched on so many really areas that I guess we could just talk for hours about. And there are a few more questions in the chat, which I think, again, just open up more avenues for thinking about the keynote, thinking about the discussion we've had now. And maybe there'll be a chance in one of the breakout lunch rooms to talk about that amongst whoever's there. Are there any concluding remarks that you wanted to make? I guess one of the issues that we haven't touched on are issues of cultural value. And I mean, we've kind of have touched on it, but maybe not directly, and what amateur theatre brings to that. So maybe as a concluding remark, you could all say something about the relationship between amateur theatre and value, and then we can all go and have lunch.
Shall I start that one? We're all looking a bit, because in a sense, it's all about value, and it's all about the way in which you know, this particular aspect of theatre is both valued and seen to be valued, but also forms an important part of the kind of cultural ecology of and cultural landscape of England. And we were looking at England because we didn't want to generalise about other countries in the UK. And I think there's, I think the thing to say was that we saw this as an empathetic piece of research. We weren't looking to kind of impose a reading on it. We wanted to allow it to breathe and find out what was there. So what we were trying to do, I suppose, is to offer an act of cultural recognition for a sector that I think has been maligned and overlooked, and the value of that does impinge upon the work that we do as academics, and that relationship between the professional theatre and the amateur sector, I think, is part of the kind of value system of this country. And I think they're mutually dependent in ways that perhaps aren't always recognised.
Yeah, and just to add that it's sort of the process of going through it has sort of just reminded me and taught me more about that what we call cultural value might need to get much bigger, much baggier, and we might need to think about it as a really complex thing and not imagine that it's kind of you know, monolithic, that we should be open to kind of wider senses of cultural economies in the multiple and the diversity of that, in terms of how people are engaged with it and what it can teach us about participation.
And I think I'd bring in a kind of how those ideas around cultural value kind of impact the research methodologies that we used. You know, it was very much about being in the room, whereas amateur theatre is often derided in terms of its final kind of product. We wanted to kind of shift away from that focus on production necessarily and look about what happens in the room, what happens in the rehearsal space, what happens in the making spaces, the building of sets, what is it about social relations and community building. So I think there was a shift in terms of what we were looking at, which kind of gave way where we were putting the kind of value of the work that we were investigating here.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody who is in the audience for coming along and asking such interesting questions. And I will look forward to picking up on some of these themes with people in person or hopefully next year, and perhaps in some of the breakout spaces later on. So with that, we'll bring it to a conclusion. Thank you very much, everybody.